The morning sun hadn't quite burned off the last of the night's chill when he stepped onto the sidewalk in front of First Southern Trust Bank. He moved slowly, not because he was weak, he was strong for his age, but because every step carried weight like he was walking through deep water. His shoes were polished, the kind you'd wear to church or a funeral, and his suit, though clearly old, had been pressed clean. A thin wool overcoat hung from his shoulders, and in his right hand he held a cane carved from dark wood, its handle worn smooth by decades of use. Slung over his left shoulder was a satchel, brown leather, cracked at the edges, held together by a brass clasp that had lost its shine long ago. People passed him on the street without a second glance. Office workers with coffee cups, delivery drivers double-parked, a young couple arguing about whose turn it was to pick up dry cleaning. No one noticed the quiet dignity in the way he stood, the way his eyes scanned the building like he was remembering something no one else could see. To them, he was just another old man, maybe lost, maybe harmless. Definitely not someone who belonged in a place like this, a gleaming glass and steel bank in the heart of downtown, where money moved in silent digital rivers and decisions were made behind closed doors by people who never touched cash. But he wasn't lost, and he wasn't harmless. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside. The air changed instantly, cooler, drier, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and new carpet. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers. Teller windows lined one wall, each with a smiling employee in a crisp navy blazer. A digital board ticked off mortgage rates and stock indices. Everything was neat, controlled, efficient. It was the kind of place that made you feel small if you didn't have a six-figure balance. He walked straight to the reception desk, his cane tapping once, twice, 3 times on the marble floor. The young woman behind the counter looked up, her smile automatic but polite. She had a name tag that read Tasha, and her nails were painted a soft pink. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" she asked, voice bright. He didn't smile back, not because he was rude, but because this wasn't a social call. He placed his satchel gently on the counter, then leaned slightly on his cane. His voice was low, steady, and clear, like gravel smoothed by a river. "I own this building," he said. "I'd like to speak with the branch manager." For a split second, Tasha didn't react. Then she blinked. Her smile tightened at the edges. She glanced past him as if expecting someone, a son, a caretaker, a social worker, to step forward and explain. "Oh, okay," she said carefully, trying not to sound dismissive. "And your name, sir?" "Ezekiel Holloway," he said. "But most folks just call me Zeke." She typed something into her computer, though there was no reason to. She wasn't looking him up, she was buying time. "Mr. Holloway, do you have an appointment with the manager?" "No," he said, "but I don't need one. This is my property." That's when the first laugh came. It wasn't loud, just a soft snort from one of the tellers a few feet away. Then another teller, a man in his 20s, turned to his co-worker and whispered something with a smirk. Tasha's cheeks flushed pink. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Sir, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. This is First Southern Trust. We've been here for over 40 years. Zeke didn't flinch. He just looked at her, his eyes dark and calm, like deep water. 40 years don't erase 100, he said simply. Tasha hesitated. She could have called security. She could have told him to leave. But something in his posture, the way he stood so straight, the quiet certainty in his voice made her pause. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe deep down she sensed this wasn't just another confused senior. "I'll let Ms. Caldwell know you're here," she said, picking up the phone. While she dialed, Zeke turned slightly and looked around the lobby. His gaze lingered on the marble columns, the brass fixtures, the sleek digital displays. But it wasn't admiration he felt. It was recognition, like seeing an old friend who'd changed their name and moved cities but still carried the same scars. The manager, Diane Caldwell, arrived within minutes. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, with a no-nonsense bun and a blazer that probably cost more than Zeke's monthly pension. She'd been told an elderly gentleman was causing a scene, but when she saw him, standing there with his satchel and his cane, calm as Sunday morning, she didn't see a scene. She saw a problem she'd rather not deal with before her 10 a.m. meeting. "Mr. Holloway?" she said, extending a hand. He didn't take it. Not out of rudeness, but because his hands were full, his cane in one, the satchel strap looped over the other. "I own this building," he repeated, same words, same tone. Diane's smile was professional, practiced. I understand you feel that way, sir, but I can assure you, First Southern Trust holds the legal title to this property. Title can be stolen, Zeke said. Deeds can be buried, but truth don't rot. A few customers had stopped to watch now. One woman pulled out her phone. Not to record yet, but just in case something happened. Diane felt the pressure. She didn't want a disturbance, not here. Not today. Why don't we step into my office? She said, gesturing toward a glass-walled room at the back of the lobby. We can talk privately. Zeke nodded once. Fair enough. He followed her, his steps slow but sure. The lobby seemed to exhale as they disappeared behind the door. Inside the office, Diane offered him a chair. He sat, placing the satchel on his lap like it was something precious, which to him it was. Mr. Holloway, she began, sitting across from him, hands folded neatly on the desk. I appreciate you coming in, but I'm afraid there's been a mistake. This bank has owned this property since 1982. Before that, it was a department store. There's no record of any prior ownership by someone with your name. Zeke didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just unclasped the satchel and reached inside. What he pulled out first was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, its edges frayed. He smoothed it carefully on the desk. It was a deed. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. The parcel of land situated at 317 Commerce Street, Memphis, Tennessee, hereby granted to Mr. Isaiah Holloway. Dated October 12, 1919, signed by Silas Thorne. Diane frowned. That's over 100 years old. Even if it's real, it has no legal standing today. Maybe not in your books, Zeke said, but it's real in the ground. My granddaddy built his bank right here. Holloway Savings and Loan. Opened in 1923. Served colored folks when nobody else would. Gave loans to farmers, teachers, shop owners. Helped families buy homes, start businesses. He pulled out another document, a tax receipt from 1927 stamped by the city. Then a newspaper clipping. Local hero Isaiah Holloway honored for community leadership. Then a small, sepia-toned photo of a proud black man in a three-piece suit standing in front of a brick building, with a sign that read, Holloway Savings and Loan. Diane stared at the photo. The building in the picture. It was this building. Or at least the bones of it. The facade had been redone, the windows replaced, but the shape, the placement, it matched. This is interesting, she said carefully. But history doesn't equal ownership. Properties change hands. Cities grow. Things get rebuilt. My granddaddy didn't sell, Zeke said quietly. He disappeared in 1954. One day he was here, the next, gone. No body, no note. Just gone. And 2 weeks later, the city took the building for public use. Never paid a dime. Never told the family why. Diane shifted in her chair. She'd heard stories like this before. Whispers of land taken. Businesses shut down. Families pushed out during the so-called urban renewal projects of the 1950s and 60s. But those were old wounds, buried, not something you dealt with over coffee in a modern bank office. I'm sorry for your family's loss, she said sincerely. But legally, there's nothing I can do. The statute of limitations. Don't talk to me about statutes, Zeke interrupted, not angrily, but with a weariness that came from a lifetime of being told too late. I ain't here to sue. I'm here to reclaim. This land was stolen. Not sold, not abandoned. Stolen. And stolen things can be returned. He closed the satchel gently, as if tucking a child into bed. Then he stood. I'll be back tomorrow, he said. Same time. And the day after that. Until somebody listens. Not with their ears, but with their conscience. Diane wanted to argue. To explain procedure, policy, precedent. But something in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't desperation. It was patience. The kind of patience that comes from knowing you're right, even if the world takes a century to catch up. She walked him to the door. Outside, the sun was higher now, warming the pavement. People hurried past, unaware of the quiet earthquake that had just shaken the foundation of their everyday bank. Back inside, Diane returned to her office. She looked at the empty chair where Zeke had sat. Then she picked up the phone. Get me legal, she said, and pull every record we have on this property going back to 1950. I don't care how long it takes. Meanwhile, Zeke walked down the street, his satchel bumping gently against his hip.
He didn't look back.
He didn't need to. He knew they'd laughed. He'd heard it. The soft chuckles, the exchanged glances, the way the air shifted when people think they're dealing with a fool. But he also knew something they didn't. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs time, and time he had plenty of. The bank's legal team didn't take long to respond. 2 business days to be exact. They sent a letter, formal and cold, printed on thick paper with the bank's logo at the top. It said in careful legal language that Mr. Holloway's claim had no basis in current property law, that the statute of limitations for adverse possession or title disputes had expired by several decades, and that First Southern Trust held clear, marketable title to the property. They suggested he consult an attorney if he wished to pursue the matter further, but strongly implied it would be a waste of time and money. Zeke read the letter once, then folded it neatly and tucked it into the back pocket of his coat. He didn't throw it away. He kept it, not as a threat but as a record. Proof that they'd been told. He didn't go back to the bank the next morning. Not right away. Instead, he went to the public library downtown, the old stone building with tall windows and creaky wooden floors that smelled like paper and dust. He'd been coming here since he was a boy, back when they made him use the colored entrance around back. Now the doors were open to everyone, but the past still lived in the quiet corners. He asked the librarian for help finding city records from the 1950s, property transfers, condemnation notices, anything tied to 317 Commerce Street. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, didn't ask why. She just nodded and led him to the microfilm room. For 3 days, Zeke sat in that dim room, squinting at flickering images of old newspapers and city ledgers. His eyes burned, his back ached, but he didn't stop. He found the notice, buried in a tiny column of the Memphis Daily on March 18, 1954. City acquires property at 317 Commerce for public infrastructure project. Owner, Isaiah Holloway, deceased. Deceased. But Isaiah Holloway hadn't died in 1954. Zeke knew that for sure. His grandfather had vanished in February. No death certificate, no obituary, just gone. And yet the city had declared him dead to take his land. Zeke made copies. He also found a photo in the archives, a black and white shot of city workers boarding up Holloway Savings and Loan. The sign was still hanging, crooked like it was crying. On the 4th morning, he returned to the bank. This time, he didn't go to the front desk. He walked straight to the glass office at the back and knocked once, firmly. Diane Caldwell looked up, startled. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon, especially after the letter. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closed the door behind him, placed the satchel on her desk. "I brought more," he said. He laid out the documents, one by one. The fake deceased notice, the photo of the boarded-up bank, a notarized statement from a man named Reverend Elijah Boone, now long gone, but his signature still clear, who swore he saw city officials meet with Isaiah 2 days before he disappeared. They offered him money to leave town, the statement read. He refused, said this bank was his people's lifeline. Diane read it slowly. Her professional mask was still in place, but her fingers tapped nervously on the desk. "Mr. Holloway, even if this is true, it's history. The bank didn't exist back then. We bought this property in good faith." "Good faith don't fix bad deeds," Zeke said. "You're sitting in a building built on stolen ground. That don't make you innocent, just unaware." He reached into the satchel again and pulled out a small rusted metal box. It was no bigger than a shoebox, sealed with a padlock so old the keyhole was nearly filled with grime. He set it on the desk. "My granddaddy buried this in the basement before he vanished," Zeke said. "Said if anything happened to him, I'd know where to look. Took me years to find it after they tore the old foundation out for your fancy vaults. But I found it, buried under concrete." Diane stared at the box. "What's in it?" "Proof," Zeke said simply. "Proof that he never gave up this land. Proof that he was planning to fight." He didn't open it. Not yet. He just let it sit there between them, heavy with silence. Then he leaned forward slightly. "I ain't asking for money. I ain't asking for an apology, though that'd be nice. I'm asking for what's right. This place, it was more than bricks and mortar. It was hope, for folks who had none. When white banks turned them away, my granddaddy said yes. When the city redlined their neighborhoods, he drew new lines, with ink and trust. Diane looked down at her hands. She'd worked in banking for 23 years. She believed in rules, in systems, in clean ledgers. But this wasn't in any ledger. This was in the bones of the city. I'll forward this to corporate legal, she said finally. But I can't promise anything. I don't need promises, Zeke replied. I need truth. He left the box on her desk, didn't take it with him. Keep it, he said. Open it when you're ready to see. That afternoon, Diane did something she hadn't done in years. She called her father. He was 89, living in a retirement home outside Nashville. She asked him about the old days in Memphis, about black businesses, about what happened to them. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There was a bank, run by a proud man. They shut it down quietly, said it was for progress. But we knew. We all knew." Diane hung up with a lump in her throat. Meanwhile, word had started to spread. One of the tellers, the one who'd laughed, had told her cousin, who posted about it on social media. Old man came in today saying he owns the bank. Showed old papers. Manager looked shook. Someone else added a blurry photo of Zeke standing in the lobby, cane in hand, satchel at his side. It didn't go viral, not yet, but it stirred something. At a local diner 2 blocks away, a retired school teacher named Ms. Lorraine saw the post. Her eyes widened. She remembered Isaiah Holloway. He'd given her mother a loan to buy their first home when no one else would. She called her church group. They called others. Soon, a small circle of elders began sharing stories about loans repaid in eggs and vegetables, about Christmas savings accounts for children, about a man who kept his word when the world broke its own. Back at the bank, Diane finally opened the rusted box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 things. A second deed, this one notarized in 1951, reaffirming Isaiah's ownership. A ledger book filled with names, dates, and loan amounts, each entry signed by both lender and borrower, and a small envelope labeled "For Zeke when he's ready." Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in careful cursive. "Son, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But don't mourn me. Fight for what's ours. They'll say it's too late. They'll say the law's against you. But the law ain't always right. Truth is older than law. Stand on it. And never let them make you feel small for standing tall." Diane read it twice. Then she placed it back in the envelope and walked straight to the phone. This time, she didn't call legal. She called the regional vice president. "Sir," she said, voice steady but urgent. "We have a situation, and I think we've been sitting on stolen land for 40 years. Corporate didn't laugh this time. Within 24 hours, a team of lawyers arrived from the headquarters in Atlanta. They reviewed every document Zeke had provided. They pulled city archives, cross-referenced property records, even dug up old insurance maps. What they found unsettled them. The chain of title was broken. The 1954 transfer listed Isaiah Holloway as deceased, but no death certificate existed in county records. The city's condemnation paperwork was vague, citing public necessity without specifics, and the developer who bought the lot in 1955. He'd been a known associate of several city officials later investigated for corruption. Legally, it was a mess. Practically, it was a nightmare, but the lawyers weren't worried about justice, they were worried about liability. If Zeke filed a quiet title action, and if a judge ruled even partially in his favor, the bank's ownership could be challenged. Their mortgage agreements, their insurance, even their federal banking license could be at risk. Worse, if the media caught wind of a major bank profiting off land stolen from a black family during Jim Crow, the reputational damage would be catastrophic. So they did what big institutions do. They tried to make it go away. They offered Zeke $50,000, not as compensation, not as restitution, just a gesture of goodwill to resolve any misunderstandings. Zeke was sitting on his porch when the offer came, sipping sweet tea from a mason jar. The bank's representative, a young man in a too-tight suit, handed him the letter with a nervous smile. Zeke read it, then he folded it slowly and handed it back. "I don't want your money," he said. "I want my grandfather's name back on this building." The man stammered. "Sir, that's not possible. It's a historic landmark now. Branding guidelines." "Then tear it down," Zeke said calmly, "and build a new one with his name on it." The man left quickly, sweating despite the cool breeze. That evening, Zeke did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the old cemetery on Beale Street, the one where many of Memphis's black pioneers were buried, though often without headstones. He stood before an unmarked plot where he believed his grandfather's body might lie, if it was ever found. "I'm close, Pops," he whispered. "They're starting to listen." The next morning he returned to the bank. But this time, he didn't go inside. He sat on the top step of the entrance, placed his satchel beside him, and held up a hand-painted sign on cardboard. "This land was stolen. I'm waiting." At first, people walked by without stopping, but then a delivery driver recognized him from the social media post. He took a photo. Then a college student filming a documentary on local history stopped to ask questions. Zeke spoke softly, clearly, telling the story of Isaiah Holloway, not as a victim, but as a builder, a leader, a man who believed in his community when the world told him not to. By noon, a small crowd had gathered, not angry, not shouting, just present, listening. Inside the bank, Diane watched from her office window. Her phone buzzed nonstop, corporate media inquiries, even a call from the mayor's office asking, "What's going on with your branch?" She stepped outside, not in her blazer, just a simple blouse. She walked over to Zeke. "You don't have to do this out here," she said quietly. "Yes, I do," he replied, "because inside it's just paperwork. Out here it's people," she nodded. Then, to everyone's surprise, including her own, she sat down on the step beside him. Not in solidarity. Not yet, but in curiosity. In humility, a reporter from the local paper approached. "Can I ask what this is about?" Zeke looked at Diane. She took a breath. "It's about truth," she said, "and maybe a chance to do better." The story hit the front page the next day, and that's when the real storm began. The newspaper story landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading fast and far. The headline wasn't flashy, just plain and honest. "Elderly man claims historic bank built on stolen land." Below it, a photo of Zeke sitting on the steps, his sign propped against his knee, the bank's glass doors reflecting the morning light behind him. Diane sat beside him in the shot, arms crossed, not smiling but present. That image, two people from different worlds sharing a sidewalk, said more than any article could. By mid-morning, the bank's phone lines were jammed. Not with angry customers, but with voices from the past. A woman called from Arkansas, voice trembling, saying her father got his first loan from Holloway Savings and Loan in 1931 to buy a mule and plow. "He paid it back in corn and gratitude," she said. Said Mr. Holloway never charged interest, just asked you to help someone else when you could. Another call came from a retired postal worker in Chicago who remembered walking 6 blocks as a boy to deposit his nickel savings into a passbook with Isaiah's signature on the cover. "That bank made us feel like we mattered," he said. "Like we owned something in a world that kept telling us we didn't." Inside the bank, the mood had shifted. Tellers whispered during breaks. The young man who'd laughed on day one now avoided the front window. One employee printed out the newspaper article and taped it to the break room fridge. No one took it down. Zeke kept coming back. Every morning at 7, rain or shine, he'd appear on the steps with his satchel and his sign. He never shouted, never blocked the door, just sat, quiet and steady like a tree that had grown through concrete. People started bringing him coffee. A teenager from a nearby high school brought him a folding chair. An elderly woman handed him a thermos of soup one cold afternoon and said, "My mama used to bank with your granddaddy. She'd be proud of you." Then came the historians. Dr. Langston, A professor from the local university who specialized in Black economic history showed up with a thick binder of research. He'd dug through city archives, old insurance maps, even FBI files declassified decades ago. He sat beside Zeke and laid out what he'd found. Holloway Savings and Loan wasn't just a bank. It was part of a network of over 200 Black-owned financial institutions that thrived in the early 1900s, especially in the South. Most were destroyed, not by market failure, but by coordinated pressure, redlining, false audits, threats, and in some cases, arson or forced closures under the guise of urban renewal. This wasn't an accident, Dr. Langston said quietly, so only Zeke and a few nearby listeners could hear. It was a system, and your grandfather's bank was one of the strongest in the region. That made him a target. Zeke listened, nodding slowly. He'd always known it wasn't just bad luck, but hearing it confirmed, backed by documents, dates, names, felt like someone finally turning on a light in a room that had been dark for 70 years. Word spread online, too. Not in a viral, meme-y way, but in the quiet corners of social media where people share stories that matter. A TikTok video showed Zeke accepting a cup of coffee from a young barista, then tipping his hat in thanks. The caption read, "This man's granddaddy built a bank for people who were told they didn't deserve one. Now he's asking for it back," and they laughed at him. The video got tens of thousands of views, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt real. Then came the elders. One Saturday morning, a group of 6 older men and women arrived together, dressed in their Sunday best. They walked slowly up the steps and stood behind Zeke without a word. One of them, a woman with silver braids and a cane of her own, placed a hand on his shoulder. "We remember," she said simply. More came the next day, then the next. Soon a small but steady gathering formed every morning. Mostly older folks, some younger allies, all standing in respectful silence. No chants, no signs except Zeke's, just presence, a living memorial. Inside the bank, corporate was panicking. Stock prices dipped slightly, not enough to crash, but enough to make executives nervous. A major investor called asking if the Memphis situation posed a reputational risk. Legal sent a memo urging immediate resolution to avoid precedent-setting implications. Marketing drafted statements about community engagement and historical awareness, but nothing felt genuine. Diane, meanwhile, had stopped sleeping well. She kept seeing Isaiah Holloway's face in the old photo, the pride in his eyes, the straightness of his posture. She imagined him walking into banks as a young man, being turned away, told his money wasn't welcome. And yet he built his own. He created a place where dignity wasn't a privilege, it was the policy. One evening after closing, she stayed late. She pulled up old photos of the building before the bank moved in. She found a 1948 image of Holloway Savings and Loan, the brick facade, the large windows, the hand-painted sign. People stood outside, men in hats, women in dresses, children holding savings books. They weren't just customers. They were community. She printed the photo. The next morning, before Zeke arrived, she taped it to the glass door of the bank right at eye level. When Zeke saw it, he stopped. He stared at the photo for a long time. Then he looked at Diane, who stood just inside the doorway. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. No words needed. That same day, something unexpected happened. A young teller, the one who'd snapped a photo for a private group chat on day 1, walked out during her break. She sat beside Zeke and said, "My great-granddaddy, he got a loan from your granddaddy to open a barbershop. Said it saved his family." She pulled out her phone and showed Zeke a faded black and white picture of a smiling man standing in front of a shop with a striped pole. "We still have the shop. It's been in the family for 3 generations. Zeke reached into his satchel and pulled out the old ledger. He flipped through the pages until he found it. James Whitfield, 75 loan. Barbershop, repaid 1929. He pointed to the entry.
"There he is." The young woman's eyes filled with tears.
She didn't say much after that. Just sat with him for a while, looking at the past like it was a bridge to the present. News crews started showing up, not just local, but national. They set up cameras across the street, but Zeke refused most interviews. "This ain't about me," he'd say. "It's about what was done, and what can still be fixed." But one reporter, a woman who'd covered civil rights stories for decades, sat with him quietly for an hour before asking a single question. What do you want to happen? She asked. I want them to stop pretending it didn't happen, Zeke said. I want my granddaddy's name remembered, not as a victim but as a builder, and I want this place to mean something again, not just for profit, for people. The story began to shift. It wasn't just about property law anymore. It was about memory, about repair, about the quiet violence of erasure, and the courage it takes to say, I'm still here. Then came the leak. Diane hadn't planned to do it. But after another late night reading through internal emails, ones marked confidential and for leadership only, she couldn't stay silent. In one thread from 1987, a former bank executive wrote, Title on Commerce Street is technically clouded due to pre-1960 irregularities, but risk is minimal. Recommend no action unless challenged. Another email from 2003 said, Historical land disputes in Memphis area. Avoid public discussion. No PR value. They knew. They'd known for decades. Diane copied the emails. She didn't send them to the press. She printed them and left them on Zeke's chair one morning, folded neatly under his sign. He read them slowly. Then he handed them to Dr. Langston. Within hours, the emails were in the hands of a local investigative journalist. By evening, they were part of a new story. Bank knew about disputed ownership for decades, internal records show. The backlash was swift. Community groups called for boycotts. Faith leaders held a prayer vigil on the steps. A city council member demanded a public hearing. Even other banks distanced themselves, issuing statements about ethical stewardship and historical accountability. First, Southern Trust scrambled. They issued a bland press release saying they were reviewing historical records with due diligence. But the public wasn't buying it. Trust once broken is hard to rebuild, especially when the cracks have been there for generations. Zeke, though, remained calm. He kept showing up, kept sitting, kept listening. One afternoon, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, approached him with her mother. She held out a drawing. A brown-skinned man in a suit standing in front of a building with a big sign that said Holloway Bank. Above it, she'd written in crayon, Heroes. Zeke took the drawing gently. Thank you, sweetheart, he said. This means more than you know. He tucked it into his satchel right next to his grandfather's letter. That night, alone in his small apartment, he opened the satchel and looked at the drawing. Then he looked at the old photo of Isaiah. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. Not for money, not for revenge, but for recognition, for restoration, because what good is land if its story is forgotten? What good is a bank if it doesn't serve the soul of the people? He knew the fight wasn't over. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. The steps weren't just stone anymore. They were a stage, a witness, a promise. And every morning when he sat down with his satchel and his sign, he wasn't just waiting. He was reminding the world that some debts aren't paid in dollars, they're paid in truth. It was a rainy Thursday when the retired judge showed up. She didn't come with cameras or a crowd, just a black umbrella, sensible shoes, and a look in her eyes that said she'd seen too much to be surprised, but not so much that she'd stopped caring. She found Zeke on the steps as usual, though the rain had driven most people inside. He sat under the bank's overhang, satchel on his lap, sipping from a thermos someone had left him that morning. She didn't introduce herself right away, just stood there for a moment watching him. Then she said, You look like your grandfather. Zeke looked up, startled. You knew him? I was a child, she said, stepping closer. My father was a lawyer. He tried to help Isaiah after the city started circling his bank like vultures. Said they called it progress, but it smelled like theft. She sat down beside him, folding her umbrella with care. My name is Martha Bellwether. I served on the probate bench for 28 years. Retired 5 years ago, but I've been following your story. Zeke nodded slowly. You here to tell me it's too late? No, she said. I'm here to tell you it might not be. She reached into her coat and pulled out a manila folder, protected in a plastic sleeve. I've been digging. Not just in public records, in places most folks don't think to look. Old FBI files. Court depositions sealed for national security. Letters between city officials that were never meant to see daylight. She opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents Zeke had never seen. One was a sworn statement from a former city clerk, given in 1962 to a civil rights investigator. describing how Isaiah Holloway was summoned to a meeting at City Hall in February 1954. They told him to sign over the property or face consequences, the statement read. He refused, said his bank belonged to his people. 2 days later, he vanished. Another document was a police report never filed, just typed on a carbon copy, detailing a tip that Isaiah had been seen boarding a bus to Chicago, but witnesses later said he never arrived. A third was a letter from a white businessman who'd tried to buy the bank in 1953. He wouldn't sell, the letter said. Said it wasn't his to sell, it belonged to the community. But the most chilling piece was a memo from the local FBI field office, dated March 1954. Subject Isaiah Holloway. No criminal record. Active in NACP. Bank under scrutiny by City Redevelopment Committee. Disappearance under investigation. Low priority. At the bottom, someone had handwritten, "Case closed. Presumed relocated." They didn't even look, Martha said quietly. They just erased him. Zeke's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. He'd spent his whole life wondering what happened to his grandfather. Now, in black and white, he saw the truth. Isaiah hadn't run. He'd been silenced. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, voice rough. "Because there's a legal path forward," Martha said. "It's narrow. It's risky. But it exists. The original deed was never legally voided. The city's condemnation was based on a false declaration of death. That means the title was never properly transferred. It's what we call a clouded title. Technically, the land still belongs to Isaiah Holloway's estate." Zeke looked at her. "And who's the estate?" "You are," she said, "as his only living heir." She explained that under Tennessee law, if a person disappears and is later presumed dead without a will, their property passes to their descendants. Isaiah had no children except Zeke's father, who'd passed years ago, making Zeke the sole heir. The problem? No court had ever declared Isaiah legally dead, and without that, the estate couldn't be settled. "But," Martha said, leaning forward, "there's a way to fix that. I can help you file an emergency petition to unseal the original 1954 court records. If we can prove the city acted fraudulently, a judge could rule that the deed is still valid, and that First Southern Trust's lease is built on stolen ground." Zeke was quiet for a long time. Rain tapped softly on the awning above them. "What if they fight it?" "They will," Martha said. "But they're already losing in the court of public opinion. Now we give them a legal reason to do the right thing." The next week, Martha filed the motion. She didn't go through flashy lawyers or press conferences. She went straight to the courthouse, to a judge she'd known for 30 years. A no-nonsense woman who believed the law should serve justice, not just procedure. The hearing was set for 10 days later. First Southern Trust sent a team of attorneys, all in matching suits, armed with binders thicker than phone books. They argued that the case was moot, that historical grievances shouldn't override modern, commercial certainty, and that reopening a 70-year-old file would open the floodgates to endless claims. Martha stood alone at the plaintiff's table, but she spoke with the weight of decades behind her. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. She just laid out the facts: a deed, a disappearance, a false death declaration, a rushed condemnation, and decades of silence. Then she played her final card. She called Diane to the stand. The bank manager walked in looking pale but resolute. Under oath, she confirmed everything: the internal emails, the knowledge of title issues, the $50,000 offer. When asked why she'd come forward, she said simply, "Because it was wrong. And I got tired of pretending it wasn't." The courtroom fell silent. 2 days later, the judge ruled. She didn't grant full ownership back, not yet. But she did something almost as powerful. She ordered the unsealing of all 1954 court and city records related to 317 Commerce Street. She also declared that the original deed from 1919 had never been legally extinguished, and that First Southern Trust's title was potentially defective. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a crack in the wall, and cracks let in light. Within hours, the news spread. Legal analysts called it unprecedented. Historians called it long overdue. Community members called it a miracle. But the real earthquake hit the bank's boardroom. First Southern Trust's top executives held an emergency meeting. The legal risk was now real, not just theoretical. If Zeke filed a quiet title action and won, the bank could lose the building. Worse, they'd owe decades of back rent to the rightful owner. And with the DOJ already investigating historical land theft in several southern cities, this case could become a national example. Panic set in. Stock prices dropped again, this time sharply. A major shareholder threatened to pull out unless the bank resolved the Memphis matter with moral clarity, not legal evasion. That's when the leak happened, not from Diane this time, but from someone higher up. A confidential email chain between the CEO and the general counsel was sent to a national news outlet. In it, the CEO wrote, "We can't afford to lose this. Not just the property, the narrative. If we're seen as profiting from Jim Crow theft, we're finished." The counsel replied, "Offer full restitution. Rename the branch. Fund a foundation. Make it a redemption story, not a scandal." The email went public the next morning. The bank had no choice now. Denial was off the table. Damage control was too late. The only path forward was honesty. Zeke, meanwhile, stayed on the steps. But now people didn't just bring him coffee. They brought ideas. A local architect sketched a redesign of the lobby with Isaiah's portrait and a community meeting space. A group of retired teachers proposed a financial literacy program for teens, named after Holloway Savings and Loan. Even a few bank employees came out during lunch to talk, not as staff, but as neighbors. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Martha sat beside Zeke again. "They're scared," she said. "Good," Zeke replied. "Maybe now they'll listen." He opened his satchel and pulled out his grandfather's letter. He read it aloud, not for the first time, but maybe for the last time in this chapter. "Stand on it. And never let them make you feel small for standing tall." Martha smiled. "He'd be proud of you." Zeke looked at the bank, the glass, the steel, the logo that had meant power for so long. Soon it might mean something else. Not just a place to store money, but a place to heal. Inside, Diane stared at the same photo of Isaiah Holloway she'd taped to the door weeks ago. She picked up the phone and called corporate, not to report, but to propose. "We don't just give him money," she said. "We give him back his legacy." And for the first time, someone at the top said, yes, the storm wasn't over. But the wind had changed direction. And Zeke? He kept sitting. Not because he needed to prove anything anymore, but because someone had to hold the space until the past and the future could finally meet. The morning of the ribbon cutting was clear and warm, the kind of spring day that feels like a fresh start. People began gathering before sunrise. Neighbors, elders, students, even a few former bank employees who'd worn their old Navy blazers one last time. They stood quietly on the sidewalk where just months before, an old man with a satchel had sat alone, holding a sign that said, "This land was stolen. I'm waiting." Now, a banner stretched across the front of the building. Holloway Legacy Bank, a place for community, not just capital. The old First Southern Trust logo was gone. In its place, a new emblem, a hand holding a key over an open book with the words, "Trust built on truth." Beneath it, Zeke arrived just after 7. He wore the same suit he'd worn on that first day, the one with the faint shine on the elbows, but today, it was paired with a crisp white shirt and a tie the color of deep earth. His cane tapped softly on the pavement as he walked, and his satchel hung at his side, lighter now, as if it had finally released its burden. He didn't go straight to the front. He paused at the edge of the crowd, watching. A young boy pointed at the banner and asked his mother, "Who's Holloway?" She knelt and said, "A man who believed in us when no one else did." Nearby, a group of high school students held handmade signs, "Banking with Purpose." History isn't past, it's present, and Granddaddy's dream lives here. Diane stood near the entrance, dressed not in a power suit, but in a simple dress with a Holloway Legacy pin at her collar. She saw Zeke and walked over. No handshake this time, just a nod, deep and quiet like two trees acknowledging the same wind. "You ready?" she asked. Zeke looked up at the building, really looked. Not at the glass or the steel, but at the spirit beneath it. "Been ready," he said. "Just took the world a while to catch up." Inside, the lobby had been transformed. The cold marble and digital tickers were gone. In their place, warm wood floors. walls lined with framed photos of black entrepreneurs from Memphis history, and a long community table in the center where people could sit, talk, or meet with financial counselors. At the far end, in a glass case lit by soft light, sat Zeke's satchel, open now, its contents displayed, the 1919 deed, the ledger, the rusted box, the crayon drawing from the little girl, and his grandfather's letter. A small plaque beneath it read, "Proof that truth outlives power." At 10 o'clock, the crowd hushed. A local pastor offered a blessing, not for the building, but for the people who would fill it. Then a teenage girl, selected by a community vote, stepped forward and read a poem she'd written about her great-grandmother, who'd saved pennies in a Holloway passbook to buy her first sewing machine. Then it was time. Zeke and Diane stood side by side at the ribbon, red and gold, woven with threads of kente cloth, a gift from a local artisan. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded, but Zeke didn't look at them. He looked at the ground beneath his feet, then up at the sky as if checking in with someone only he could see. He whispered something too low for anyone to hear. Then together, he and Diane cut the ribbon. Applause rose, not loud or flashy, but steady like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. Afterward, people flowed inside. Not to open accounts, not yet, but to remember. An elderly man touched the photo of Isaiah Holloway and said, "I deposited my first dollar here when I was 6. A young woman sat at the community table and filled out an application for a microloan to start a catering business. A group of kids gathered around the glass case, wide-eyed, as a docent explained what each item meant. Zeke didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. He walked through the lobby slowly, greeting people, accepting hugs, listening more than he spoke. At one point, he stopped by the teller counter, now labeled Community Support Desk, and placed a single dollar bill on the wood. "I'd like to open a savings account," he said, voice gentle. The young woman behind the counter, newly hired, part of a program to train local youth in finance, smiled. "Name, please?" "Ezekiel Holloway," he said. "But you can call me Zeke." She typed his name into the system. On the screen, under branch affiliation, it now read, "Holloway Legacy Bank, founded 1923, restored 2024. She printed a passbook, the first in nearly 70 years, and handed it to him. On the cover, embossed in gold, was the new logo. Zeke ran his fingers over it. Then he tucked it into his coat pocket right over his heart. Later that afternoon, after the crowd had thinned, Zeke sat alone on a bench near the back of the lobby. Diane found him there, sipping water from a paper cup. "They're calling it a model now," she said, sitting beside him. "Other banks are reaching out. Want to know how we did it?" Zeke chuckled softly. "We didn't do it. Truth did. People did. Patience did." She looked at him. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, "we build. Not just a bank. A promise that no one gets left out, that no one's story gets buried. The Holloway Legacy Trust, established with the bank's full cooperation, would do more than manage the building. It would fund small business loans for overlooked entrepreneurs, offer free financial education in schools, and preserve the history of Black economic life in Memphis." Diane, stepping down from her corporate role, had agreed to serve as the trust's first director of community equity. "Turns out," she'd told the board, "I didn't want to manage money. I wanted to make it mean something." As the sun dipped low, casting golden light through the tall windows, Zeke stood to leave. But before he did, he walked over to the glass case one last time. He placed his hand on the glass right over the satchel. "We home, pups," he whispered. No one heard him but the walls, but that was enough. In the weeks that followed, the story didn't fade. It grew roots. Schools brought students on field trips. Historians used the lobby as a living classroom. And every morning at 7, Zeke still came, not to sit on the steps, but to have coffee with whoever showed up. Sometimes it was a young entrepreneur with a business plan. Sometimes it was a grandparent sharing stories. Sometimes it was just silence, shared between people who finally felt seen. The bank didn't make headlines anymore, but it made a difference. Loans were approved not just on credit scores, but on character. Meetings were held not in boardrooms, but at the community table. And every quarter, the trust published a report, not on profits, but on progress. How many dreams were funded, how many families were helped, how many names were remembered. One evening, as Zeke walked home, a neighbor called out from her porch, They say you changed the whole city. He smiled. Nah, he said. I just reminded it of who it already was. Because the truth is, justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. A man with a satchel, a deed, and the courage to wait. Sometimes it's a manager who chooses conscience over comfort. Sometimes it's a community that refuses to forget. And sometimes, after decades of being told too late, the world finally says, not yet. The building still stood on Commerce Street. But now it stood for something more. Not just brick and glass, but belonging. Not just transactions, but trust. Not just history, but hope, passed down like a satchel from one generation to the next. And in that hope, everyone found a place to come home.